Happy Sunday, folks. So no, I'm not Jim Werbineth, and I apologize for that. I hope everyone can forgive the fact that I'm not Jim Werbineth. But Jim's down with the flu and doesn't have his voice back yet, and so he's asked me to tag in his place for today's presentation. So I'm not going to be talking about the Incheon invasion and the Korean War because I'm not qualified to do that. One would argue I'm probably not qualified to do the one I'm about to do, but that's not going to stop me. Also welcome to anybody who's watching this after the fact. You missed us live at the ACDC. The comments that you will see popping up are those attendees who were at the ACDC with us and showing up live as a part of the show. And so in the future, if you want to be a live part of some of these discussions, you just need to register and join us at the Armchair Dragoons Digital Convention or any of the other special events that we do like that. And you're welcome to join us that way. And so for today, we're going to be talking about civilians on hexagonal battlefields, and I hope folks will indulge the conversation on this one here. This is an update to a presentation I did way back in 2006, and had updated once along the way, but there's been a bunch of new developments in this area, certainly since 2006. But even just within the last 8 to 10 years, there's been quite a bit that has changed along the way. And so this is what we're going to take a look at, and we're going to see how it goes. And comments are welcome, questions are welcome. We've got an extended comment time towards the end of all this. But if somebody's got a question as we're going through the slides, throw it in the chat. We'll pull it up on the screen. We'll have that conversation. So welcome to those of you that are here. Rob, I know you're always in the comments, so I appreciate you being here. Whoever else here, thanks for being here with us, and away we go. So look, civilians are a fact of war. U.S. Army and Marine Corps doctrine discuss interactions with civilians. I happen to know those best because that's, I served in the Army and have worked with the Marines a bunch. But even in the UK, their military doctrine also discusses interactions with civilians. One of the things I always thought was kind of funny is in the U.S., the urban operations, which is where you're primarily dealing with civilians, are known under the acronym MOUT, M-O-U-T. It's Military Operations in Urban Terrain. The Brits tend to refer to it as fish, fighting in someone's house. I always thought that was a, classic American clinical overspeak versus the Brits just sort of being very blunt about what it is. Look, insurgencies magnify the roles of civilians, and that's one of the reasons why this has become such a more prominent topic over the last 10, 15 years. But also, it's been one of those things that where a lot of folks want to recognize sort of the myth of the clean, sanitized war, kind of the chessboard of it's just us and the opponent out there, and we're trying to shoot each other that way. The reality is civilians are present on the battlefield, and they are an active part of any of those kinds of conflicts. And we've got to be able to properly deal with them in a very real military context. The question is, how, if at all, does that happen in the wargaming world? And so there's been greater visibility for some non-kinetic sort of air quote war games, right? We're not going to argue about what is a war game, but the idea that there's been a lot of games with war game type mechanics or war game DNA baked into them that are very focused on civilians with non-kinetic considerations. And there's also, and we'll see the discussion towards the end of this, there's been a much greater sensitivity to civilian concerns in contemporary wargame design and in contemporary wargame criticism and conversation. So we're gonna talk about those things as well. Why do war games rarely address civilians? Look, they're not a sexy part of the game. This is a challenging, difficult topic to try to tackle. More importantly, from the perspective of a game design, how do you quantify those effects? How do you play that role? If you're putting civilians in the game, to what end and what purpose, and what are the mechanics that allow them to interact with the world that exists within the design of the game? And that's a hard thing to figure out. Now, in the military, where you've got 50 people show up for a week-long war game, or in the national security world, yeah, you can deal with this because you can sort of order someone to go play the civilians, or you bring in an expert to deal with that, because those are the real world considerations you have to deal with in a national security environment, in that professional practitioner environment. Those things matter. Like there are real lives at stake. But when you and three friends get together for a beer and pretzel session on a Saturday afternoon, or when you're playing just a game for fun here at the ACDC, civilians don't often show up in those war games. And that's, some people have found a problem with that. Some people have said, no, I don't want to have to think about it. There weren't a lot of civilians on the battlefield at Gettysburg. I don't want civilians on my battlefield at Gettysburg. I just want to try and refight Gettysburg and figure out how it could have gone differently. So back in 2006, when I did the original presentation here, some of the games that I listed that included civilians, and I was not trying to be all inclusive. I was just listing a handful of examples that people might know and recognize. Victory in the West, Kolwezi, Creature That Ate Sheboygan is always a famous one that folks like to bring up. But Raid on Richmond, Ambush, Sniper, and then the Warfighter 101 series games with the Guards and Asian Thunder. Those were my designs, so I kind of knew what those were doing, and we'll talk a little bit about those here in a few minutes. But since the original presentation of this thing back in 2006, we've added the coin series. We've added the tabletop version of the digital game, This War of Mine, which is explicitly about civilians trying to survive through a war that's raging around them. Aftershock with the PackSims guys. Which is actually typoed later in this presentation, but the Aftershock guys, 7 Days to the Rhine series that appeared in some of the modern war magazines from S&T Press and Decision Games, explicitly have civilians in them. So that's a Cold War goes hot, Russians invading, across the inner German border. And it covers a lot of civilian considerations. The forthcoming Littoral Commander game from the Dietz Foundation, Sebastian was talking in his interview with Mo yesterday about the fact that there are civilians that will show up on the battlefield, and they're essentially a blocking terrain factor. But they also move very erratically. Boots on the Ground and Urban Operations from Nuts Publishing both include civilians, and those are fairly tactical level games. So the civilians get kind of up close and personal in there. So when we start talking about incorporating civilians into the games, look at the basic level. What is it we're trying to model? Why are they there? How do we model them? Why are we doing it that way? And so we can figure out within a war game, there's a variety of different models, some fairly prominent, some still fairly experimental, that talk about the different ways that military units affect each other on the battlefield, right? I can't stack units in hexes, or I have stacking limitations. I have supply limitations. I'm shooting these guys. In order to push somebody off of this terrain, I can't just shoot them from a distance. I have to physically assault into that hex. There's all kinds of different mechanics that we have for the military units, the kinetic units in the game, to affect each other. But how do we figure out how those interactions happen with civilians in those games? And that's a challenge. As a part of that, within the game mechanics, what kinds of ratings or stats do you put on these things? Like, combatants have attack and defend and movement strengths, right? How do I conduct combat, and how do I move around the tableau, right? I was going to say move around the map, but then you get something like Fields of Fire that's all card based. So what, if any, kinds of strengths do those civilian units have? How am I supposed to stat these things out? There's all kinds of values that exist for different units with variable combat values, supply values, leadership values. There's all sorts of intangibles, but how do those things impact civilians, and how do civilians potentially impact them? And what, if any, kinds of stats or numerical values do I apply to civilians in war games for how they're going to interact with the model? All right, so logistics and supply. Look, depending on the level of complexity of your logistics model in your game, and this is something I've talked about in previous presentations about, like, why you don't want a realistic logistics model in your war games. The more realistic the logistics model, the more potential touch points you have with which to interact with civilians or refugees or whatever. That second bullet down there, will military units provide logistics support to civilians on the battlefield? And maybe a simple thing with just sort of, degrading your logistics capability, or it may involve like actual assets having to transport or escort something around the map, whatever. So there's all kinds of different pieces to this in the logistics and supply realm. In the Napoleonic era and before, foraging and local procurement was sort of how armies marched. You had some logistics trains and some organization behind you, but you weren't shipping grain from France all the way across Prussia and Bavaria and everywhere else to get to, supporting Napoleon's march into Russia. You were relying on a lot of local supply. And so how does that impact your local civilian population? So that's still an issue also. Security and defensibility, right? If there's a goal for securing or potentially attacking civilians in the game, how are those mechanics going to interact in there? And that's where you start to get into unpleasant realities in the games. And we're going to discuss those in a little greater detail in a few minutes. I feel like I'm going kind of fast, but none of you guys are asking questions. So, until you ask questions, I'm going to keep moving. Look, physical impediments, right? There's only so many places people can stand on the map. And so there's limited space on the roads. There's limited space inside a fortification, right? If you bring the local population inside the castle during the siege, those civilians take up space. If you've got a whole lot of civilians trying to leave on the roads, you've got limited use of those roads for military traffic. Civilians just take up space. And so at a certain point, that's one of the things that you have to account for because they're there, like they're physically present. It's physics. You can't occupy the same space at the same time. And then again, something that's risen to prominence over the last 10, 15 years, 20 years, insurgencies and guerrillas, right? When there's one or more sets of combatants that have the ability to hide within the civilian population, suddenly the civilians get to be really important because now you've got all sorts of cover and concealment variables for your combatants that civilians, I don't want to denigrate it or sound cavalier that the civilians become part of the terrain, but they are effectively a part of the terrain for your target acquisition issues. And that becomes a challenge. How do you interact with, but it's terrain with which you can interact, and how do you do that? And that's hard to do also. All right, moving on. Look, we posed a whole bunch of questions. Here are some discussion points for how some of these things might be handled, depending on your rule set and the goals of the game. So if the game includes a complex model of supply and logistics, right? How do referees interfere with those, or referees? How do refugees interfere with your supply routes? It may be as simple as putting some movement restrictions along those routes baked into the game. In some games, you get movement bonuses for moving up and down roads. And it may be in some games, you take those movement bonuses away because the roads are so choked with civilians that you essentially don't get a movement bonus on them. There may be limitations on available supplies. If you have to divert some of your supplies to support civilians on the battlefield, this is a mechanical way in which you can account for the civilians without having to put civilian counters on the map or do something with them. You may just, dial back on the amount of supplies that are available under the assumption that you're providing some to local civilians. Same thing, in the foraging context there. So there are mechanical ways in which you can address civilians on the battlefield without actually putting a counter of a civilian on the battlefield in the logistics and supply realm. Security and defensibility. So in this case, you might actually have to put some counters on the map. We'll have to see. But where might they be secured, and what are some of the limits for where and how to secure them? How much combat power do you have to take out of the fight to provide for security or defensibility? And then you start to get into the little thornier piece that if you are securing them against something or defending them against something, your measure of success might be based on your opponent in the game attempting to attack them or damage them somehow. So now all of a sudden we are targeting civilians in the game. And that's where we start to cross some lines for some people that, it's fine to put them out there and have them essentially be a battlefield annoyance in the context of the game system. But these, as soon as you start having the ability to impact them, to shoot them, to push them around, to damage them in some way, man, that starts to really cross the line with some people. And even if it doesn't cross a personal line for you, it's still just the thought process of, hey, how do I damage a civilian counter and why and to what end? Like, people ought to be thinking about these things. And so we shouldn't shy away from what that actually means. All right, physical impediments. Again, this just goes back to the physics of they take up space. Civilians and non-combatants take up space that could otherwise be occupied by trigger pullers. And so you may, again, goes back to, we may limit what advantage the roads give us. We may actually put stacking limits on something where civilians might be assumed to be present without having to actually put a civilian counter on a map. In some cases, we may put the civilian counter on the map and then apply them against the stacking limits. Who knows? It can be helpful, as was demonstrated in that previous video about the realistic logistics on the battlefield. It can be helpful to actually put all those things on the map to assist with the visualization of the amount of space all the non-trigger pullers take up. And so to add those civilian counters to the map can really provide an eye-opening visualization to the players for how much other stuff is on the battlefield that isn't just sort of the shooty bangy kind of things. So that's those are things to consider. And so, Rob brings up a good point that crossing a line is something that folks should be worried about. It would be something that should be added. It may get added as house rules. Now, Rob also works primarily in the digital realm, where house rules are really hard to do unless you're going to hack the code on the game. House rules on tabletop games are very easy to do. You need a Sharpie and some blank markers. So that can be a little easier to do. But we're going to talk about some of those house rules and interactions here in a second. In the insurgency and guerrilla world, if combatants have the ability to hide within the civilian population, how are you going to mechanically create that in the context of the game rules? How are you going to conceal units for movement? How are you going to, if at all, quantify the level of civilian support for insurgents and guerrillas? The White Tribe game by Ben Madison, that's published by White Dog Games, covers the insurgency and outside invasions in Rhodesia, and one way in which the civilian population interacts with the Rhodesian government is the presence of support or opposition within the different provinces, and there's a marker on the map that's a handshake for when there is support for the central government on the part of those local provinces. If there is a handshake marker on the map, then the terrorist units coming in from outside of Rhodesia have a harder time getting past those local provinces. When there is no handshake marker present, it's a lot easier for them to move around. So there is a mechanical tool in that game to show the civilian support for or opposition to the insurgents and guerrillas in that specific game. So if there are going to be interactions between military and civilians, how do you characterize those interactions? Again, in the national security context, those are very important questions. A couple of dudes with some, or dudettes, a couple of folks with beer and pretzels and a table and a Saturday afternoon to play some games, they may not even want to think about that. And that's okay. That's okay. All right. One specific way that civilian interaction piece was done was something that I was the primary designer on, and that was the Warfighter series back that Bayonet Games had published back in 05 to 07 or so. For anybody interested, we are sort of noodling around with this a little bit with the possibility of reviving this system. We'll see if that actually grows legs and goes somewhere. But essentially, the tools allowed the civilians to sort of hide it allowed the insurgents to hide in the civilian population. And so it forced one player to kind of arm the civilians in order to have them be an additional combatant on their side, or it forced you to have to sort of probe the civilians and interrogate them to find out whether or not there was a combat unit hiding within that crowd. Some civilians had no combatant state. Some of them did. And so units would have a civilian side of the counter and a military / kinetic side of the counter. So there'd be different kinds of partisans hiding amongst the civilians. Some of the missions included a pacification function where you needed to approach a combatant unit, and there were mechanics for causing them to, revert to non-combatant status. You were pacifying them, or you needed to protect civilians from certain attacks, and so there was some escort mechanics to that. Again, not overly intellectually deep, but attempting to provide some mechanical tool on the map to try and find a way to address the presence of civilians on the battlefield, such that players were forced to grapple with these questions of, what do I do about civilians on the battlefield? How do I interact with them? So that's kind of what we were after there. Was it the greatest system out there? No, of course not. But it was an attempt, and that's what we were trying to do. We were asking the questions and hoping that the audience would see it as an opportunity to provide some of their own input and answers. All right. There have been some recent complaints, and I put complaints in air quotes, about war games, folks. In some cases, there's a little bit of clickbaitiness going on here. In some cases, people asking some very legitimate, important, and pointed questions. And so I've got excerpts from a variety of different articles here, and some different ways in which we'll kind of consider some of the thoughts about them. One of them, the Tabletop Games blog, was something, quite frankly, we blasted them on Twitter a little bit. This is not a very good article overall. It is written on about an 8th grade social studies paper level that sort of substitutes anecdotes for data, and the author kind of doubles down on anecdotal evidence, right? Air quotes around evidence in the comments on the article where people challenge him on it. This is the opening of the article itself. War games are often seen as controversial. By who? Like, show us the evidence. Give us a litany of sources backing up that assertion. They exist. He ignores them. Replaying atrocities that occurred during a large-scale conflict seems completely inappropriate. Well, who's replaying the atrocities? Right? Was the invasion of Normandy an atrocity? Like, there are plenty of games on D-Day. There's plenty of games on Waterloo. There's plenty of games on the Bulge. Like, we can list the top 10 greatest hits of wargaming, right? We're all used to this. But was D-Day an atrocity? If I'm replaying a D-Day game, am I replaying the atrocities that occurred during a large-scale conflict? Probably not. So if you're going to tell me about replaying the atrocities that occurred during a large-scale conflict, what are those atrocities, and what games are allowing me to replay the atrocities? Not the combat, unless you just consider all war to be an atrocity. And there's a position to be taken for that, and that's fine if that's your position. But to work from the default assumption that all wars are atrocities is a little specious. More importantly, if you're going to talk about replaying those atrocities during large-scale conflict, specify the games that allow you to do that, because I want to see that list. And that didn't happen. And so if we're talking about civilians on the battlefield and you're going to make these kinds of statements, you better bring receipts. And this author didn't. Back in October of last year, Rocky Mountain Navy recently had some comments on this on his personal site, talking about Yugoslavia's military conflicts as entertainment. The bulk of the criticism of the article is in that middle sentence of this slight excerpt, which is that there have been a lot of folks that have used video games to create mods. So, Rob, in essence, similar to those house rules you were describing, that have created some mods of particularly problematic conflicts in Yugoslavia. One of the examples they used is in the article that they used, somebody created a mod or a scenario using the Arma series of games. And the Arma series is also used by the military in a slightly upgraded version as VBS, Virtual Battle Space. That's an individual shooter level game. It's an FPS, first-person shooter level game. And these guys built a bunch of ARMA scenarios. For instance, the the Bosnian Serb army going into Srebrenica. I think I'm mispronouncing that, but I'm getting close. Back in '95, and the scenario itself includes combatants on the other side, that the Bosnian Serbs are shooting armed combatants. That is at odds with the historical record. Srebrenica was very much an ethnic cleansing, and it was shooting a lot of unarmed civilians. The mod for the game ignores that history in favor of, an ahistorical, putting other shooters at the other end. That's a historical problem on the part of that mod creator, not necessarily an underlying problem with wargaming as a whole. And so when you get to the bottom, that many of the shooter games often a distorted view of history and are blind to war crimes committed during the operations upon which they are based. That's true on the part of folks that built the mods for the games, but that's not necessarily baked into the DNA of something like the ARMA platform itself, or VBS, or any of the other first-person shooter platforms for which you can create your own scenarios. They talk about this organization identified at least 5 other board games themed around the wars in Yugoslavia in the 20th century. They didn't look very hard, because there's a good 20 or 30 of them at least. And 2 of the ones that they pulled out were very recent ones that were World War I games, with Serbian Mushterbian and March on the Drina. So they pulled out some very recent ones. They really did not dig too far back. Is it okay to enjoy war games? This was an interesting article from Punchboard a while back. The author interviews both Volko and David Thompson. It's great that Volko could just go by Volko, right? Nobody has to pronounce his last name. Nobody has to even mention his last name in the wargaming world. He's like Prince and Sting. He's just sort of that one name dude. He's the Pele of wargaming, right? He just needs one name. You don't have to give him a full name. But he interviews Volko and David in this. And the question the author is asking is, should I be enjoying something based on a conflict in which I saw hundreds, thousands, even millions of people die? That goes beyond just the military casualties into the civilian ones as well. And it's a valid point. And Volko and David make some very interesting observations in the interview in here, that historical distance does seem to be a factor for certain people. But Volko asks a very good counter question when the author is asking about enjoying games that are based on conflict. Volko's counterpoint is, why is that any different than enjoying a movie or a book or a TV show based on that war? And that's something that's very questionable in the assertions of, why is it okay to mine wars for entertainment? So Jeff brings up a good point here. The lead on the Ghost Recon series for years. Shooters and historical, you're right, in many cases don't belong in the same sentence. And folks that spend a little bit of brain power focusing on those things will absolutely recognize why not. The challenge is, and the point that's brought up by some of the authors is, the 14-year-old isn't thinking about that. To the 14-year-old, that may be as much as he ever engages with the history. I'm saying he, the dominant demographics show that it's he. It may occasionally be a she. But for those players, that may be their primary interaction with the history, is that and some, pop culture, TV, movie stuff, because they're not likely to engage deeply in the level of scholarship that many game designers do in terms of building their games, or many war game players might, or students of history might. It's going to be a very pop culture depth of history in there. So yeah, Jeff, I would 100% agree with you, but we're also coming to things with accumulated years of experience in that wargaming realm, discussing the history as portrayed in those war games. So that's a little different world that we're coming to it with. And I think that was part of the point that author was trying to make, is a lot of folks aren't going to be all that well engaged with the history there. So that's something that's a concern there. This one goes back a couple of years, playing the Nazis' political implications in analog war games. One of the points that they make is that it still tends to be a very sanitized view of the wargaming, that there are They're using squad leader as the exemplar here about how detailed it can be, and they mention the sewer rules. But they also note that squad leaders' battles take place in a social vacuum. Civilians are very rarely present in a squad leader game. Now, again, squad leader is not the only one that's guilty of. So, that's definitely an issue. Mo, ultimately, that's the point that comes out in the punch board discussion, and that's the point that Volko pushes back with. Is this happens all over the place, and how far down that slippery slope are you willing to go? What are the lines that you might be willing to cross that others might not? And to what end, and everybody's line's going to be in a different place, and that's okay. Like it's fine for people's lines to be in a different place. Recognize that, be able to articulate that, and have an adult discussion about it instead of simply telling other people what they should and shouldn't be doing necessarily. So, and again, to be clear, those lines need not be crossed in war games. Again, we talked earlier about some of the mechanical tools for having civilians present in a war game. If the primary mechanical tool of the civilians being present in a war game is that they are a physical impediment to your activities on the battlefield, it may be enough to just put some blocking counters out there and randomly move them around. Again, Sebastian brought that up in his interview with Mo yesterday, that there are opportunities to put civilians on the battlefield in the Littoral Commander game, and they have no other real game effect other than to occupy terrain and make you have to move somewhere else. If that's as far as you're going to go mechanically in the game in having those civilians be present, that's fine. It's still an additional consideration that as a player in the game you have to deal with. But again, it all comes back to what's the mechanical purpose that the civilians serve in the game. And many of the criticisms that we're talking about here, going back to the last couple of slides, going in another one or two here, are the civilians aren't present and maybe should be because otherwise the war game gets a little too sanitized. To which I'm going to push back, why should they be present? And we'll get into that a little more detail here in another slide or two. This one was an interesting one from Tally Ho Corner last spring. This was written right after the war in Ukraine broke out. And talking about, as wargamers, we take some pretty detailed looks at the ways in which battlefield systems interact, right? We can appreciate the proper way to set up an ambush in a war game. Again, going back to squad leader, right? The classic L-shaped ambush, you're able to set it up. You're able to walk your opponent right into it. You're able to put the appropriate turn and fix obstacles out there that drive the enemy directly into your engagement area, and you hammer the crap out of them. Like we can all appreciate a well-designed tactical or operational plan that comes to fruition and beats the crap out of our opponent. And that's great. But the flip side of it is, as toward the tail end of this quote here, those camera angles, that visibility of watching what we play with in hexes and counters on a map happen in real life, oh crap, I hope the crew got out of that thing, when that tank blew up, as a for instance. And and the wargamer's curse that is discussed in greater detail in this article, and I think very, very maturely, is in our brains, we're sort of juggling the combination of, wow, that was a really well executed action, with, holy crap, that guy got the hell blown out of him, or whatever it might be. Those are difficult things to juggle in the headspace there. So, again, level of abstraction in war games make playing the axis and bulge different from maybe. And Jeff, I would argue that that's probably down to the individual participants' level and desire for immersion. Some folks may be able to stand off better at a distance when it's just cardboard counters on a map versus I'm walking around in a uniform. I can't make that decision for other people. It's certainly a valid question to ask. I don't have a good answer for that. I'm not going to pretend to. Mo talks about, many of these things, all war games tend to distill down to the action of the battle itself. Maybe it depends on the game itself. One would argue that, the Third Reich series, John Prado's masterpiece, that there is quite a bit of political implication involved in there. For anybody playing the coin games, there's absolutely some political implication in there. If you're playing the warlords in a distant plane, you better be a political animal, because otherwise you get squished like a bug. So, the deep portrayal of an economic system underpinning the South, you're right, would have been a very different experience. Even having a basic resource points type of consideration for operational level logistics and supply and strategic level logistics and supply grafted onto an ACW game, that resource points mechanic from Third Reich, again, just mentioning is top of mind from talking about Praetos a second ago, would have shown the level of hopelessness of the Southern cause very early on, just because the economics were not in their favor. All right, moving on here. The challenges of realistic civilians in the game still come back to, why am I putting them in the game? And so there's a lot of these authors of some recent pieces, and I excerpted a few of them here, but there's not a shortage of them. There's another 6 or 8 that I could have included. I was trying to hold some slides for time here. These guys are all arguing that war games are a little too sanitized and ought to somehow include the uglier content of war in the game in some way. But it's clear none of these guys are game designers, because they don't really offer any sort of mechanically sound way to include this within the context of the game itself. And that's the thing. They want some content pasted on there, and completely ignoring what game mechanics are expected to be involved in this somehow. And that's a real headache when somebody like me, like game designers, looking at this going, what the hell are you talking about doing here? So the Tabletop Games blog says, of course, war games can't properly convey the suffering, death, and huge amount of destruction that took place. Removing troop counters from the board is not the same as seeing soldiers die right next to you. Great. So are we now going to include a flip book of explicit casualty photos, right? Hey, so sorry, Sergeant Johnson got shot up next to you. Here's a picture of his guts falling out of his abdomen. I guess is that what this guy's advocating? Because, otherwise, how are you expected to somehow, bring that level of destruction back home intellectually, or somehow make it more visceral? That's tough to do in a board game. It's a little easier to do in a digital game, but that's tough to do in a board game. So yeah, Mike, I am staying out of the argument of what is a war game. Like, we've done literally hours of shows on that, not going there. But one of the things that I did mention very early on, and you might not have been present when I mentioned it, is there are a lot of games, and we're gonna talk about some of them here in a second, that use war game type mechanics to deal with civilian considerations. And so to some folks, those still fall under the much broader definition, sort of group hug of war game, without getting down into sort of nitty gritty details of what is a war game. And so, again, I'm not wanting to get into an argument of what is a war game. Mo's been around for way too many of those arguments. Also, I think we're done with those for at least a week or two. The Analog Game Studies article says the only significant feature of the city environment that is ignored is the presence of civilians. So, this was something that I was talking about with some other folks in a private chat channel somewhere. So we're going to add in mechanics to track the suffering of the local civilians. Like, that's fine if that's what we want to do. But as soon as you put in mechanics for tracking the suffering of the local civilians, now I need a mechanic to move the suffering of the local civilians up and down. So now I've got to explicitly increase and decrease the suffering of local civilians. That somehow I'm keeping score on whether or not my civilians are suffering more than your civilians. And so now my opponent has an incentive to raise the suffering of my civilians on the game. Congrats, you just mechanically built in a war crimes mechanic because you're targeting the civilians on purpose. Like, is that really where we want to go in these game designs? And the kinds of questions that many of these articles challenging the absence of civilians in war games, they never take that next step intellectually. They never start to look at the second and third order effects of, hey, if I'm going to start putting civilians in the war game, now I need the ability to impact the war game, those civilians in the war game, which means I'm explicitly targeting civilians. You want to write that set of rules? Because I'm not sure I do. And that's, yeah, Jeff, you're probably largely correct. And there's nothing wrong with that. But again, it's sort of where people draw those lines are sort of up to them. And everybody's going to draw those lines in different places. What I'm trying to point out here is that some of the critiques of war games that are arguing that they are overly sanitized are valid critiques in that, yes, in fact, war games are overly sanitized, but largely to a particular purpose. And again, this goes back to they're not asking the next step in the question or the next question in this series of steps, which is, if I'm going to put in those civilian considerations that allow me to address the uglier effects of civilians on the battlefield, mechanically, I have to create the game rules that allow me to explicitly target civilians. And is that really the game that you want to design? And I would argue that for many people, no. And so, Mo, that's right. That's why in many cases, that's the limit in which civilian portrayal happens in war games. We mentioned this earlier in the talk. In many cases, they are essentially an operational annoyance. And I don't mean to trivialize the presence of civilians in a war as an operational annoyance, but in the context of the war game, that's what they become. Because nobody wants to go any deeper than that, and that's okay. So that's all right, fine. But civilians are a fact of war. They exist, and they exist all over the place. And it's interesting because for a long time, the one of the primary places where the U.S. Army did a lot of their wartime training was the National Training Center out in Fort Irwin, California, out in the middle of flipping nowhere in a desert. I know I was stationed there for a while. And in addition to doing some Blue 4 rotations, I was actually stationed at Fort Irwin. And the reason it's out there is because it is in the middle of nowhere, and you don't have to deal with a whole lot of other people getting in the way. But what it did was it gave an entire generation of the U.S. military this false sense of these very sanitized battlefields in which civilians aren't particularly present. Now, that's changed over the last 15, 18 years or so, going back to very shortly after the Global War on Terror kicked off. The National Training Center and JRTC down at Fort Polk started incorporating more civilian presence. They started building some villages out there. They started bringing in some actors to play the locals in those villages. So you did have to interact with civilians as a part of that maneuver. Civilians are a fact of war. The U.S. military ignored it for a long time, and it finally came around about a generation ago, and have gotten a lot better about it. But war games, in terms of the wargaming world, still don't tend to put civilians in the game much, in large part, I argue, because they are mechanically challenging to do. Not just that folks are looking for the sanitized version of war. I don't want to have to think about bad things when I'm playing a game, but because within the context of the game rules, it's a very tight rope to walk. Now, there's also, like I said at the top bullet there, greater visibility for non-kinetic war games that focus on civilian considerations. So we'll talk about some of those. So absolutely, the Day of Heroes has some of those challenges built in with those civilian mobs. But again, in a lot of cases, those civilian mobs are essentially operational and tactical annoyances. They're not necessarily something you have to shoot your way through. You have to avoid them, but you're not necessarily having to shoot your way through them, which, that's just sort of how they're present. They're a lot more passive in the game than they were in reality in the actual operation itself. All right. This says Aftermath. This was supposed to say Aftershock, and I apologize for the typo, and I know Rex is going to give me all kinds of crap for typos. I got it right earlier in the presentation. I just goofed it here. And look, I'm in the design credits. You would have thought I'd have got this right. The focus is on assisting the civilian population. The entire intent behind the design of the game was a multiplayer game for interagency coordination in a civilian relief mission specifically. And it's based around the early 90s relief missions for the earthquake in Haiti. Say early 90s, I think it might have been late 90s, but it was the earthquake relief mission to Haiti. And so it's the fictional country of Karana, but it's heavily based on Haiti. Again, I know this, I was at the design sessions where this thing was being built. Not a lot of what me or Brian Train designed ended up in the game. A lot of the actual game design itself came after those design sessions. in a hotel bar in Washington, D.C., with Rex and Gary Malonti sort of spitballing a variety of things and me throwing out sarcastic comments while nursing a beer. So a lot of what's actually in the game were the mechanics that were designed at the bar after the fact, based on some explorations from the Connections Game Lab design process that happened earlier in the day at the National Defense University. The focus of the game itself is on assisting the civilian population in the recovery from this earthquake. Your assets that you're looking at are things like medical assets and food and water and housing and transportation. And so you've got a variety of assets that you're trying to provide across the country, being provided by different agencies and through different means that they can put things out there. But there are still very real trade-offs. You can't help everybody all the time with everything. You don't have an unlimited supply of everything. And oh, by the way, each agency has their own specific win conditions, that it's not enough to help folks. My agency has to get an appropriate amount of the credit, or has to focus on providing just this one specific thing, or we're helping the lower class population or the upper class population, whatever it is. All of the agencies have their own agendas underneath that are not shared with the other players. And so you have trade-offs into who gets helped and how much and why. So even though you're not directly, like, shooting at and blowing up and committing war crimes against civilians, at some point you still have to say, no, those guys don't get the water they need. And I recognize that may cause some civilian casualties as a result. People might die because I'm choosing to send the water over here instead of over there. And that's part of what's built into the game. The idea, again, this game is explicitly designed as a training tool to allow relief agencies, multinational agencies, and even the military to explore the kinds of issues and decisions that need to be dealt with in an emergency relief scenario like this. And that's an important thing that you want to train and rehearse ahead of time. You don't want the first time you're thinking about these things to be when it actually matters. You'd rather be thinking about it when it's just moving cubes around on a map. But where criticisms of war games come in with, hey, we don't put the civilians on the map. We don't deal with the civilians. We don't address their concerns. We don't address the atrocities against civilians. Here's a game explicitly designed about how to help civilians in the aftermath of a catastrophe, that earthquake aftershock. And you still have bad things happen to civilians in there, because that's just how it works. Like, that's how life works. And you've got to make those decisions and trade-offs. And how do you deal with that? And so Aftershock, not Aftermath, ignore the header on here. I'm a bad person. Rex, yell at me later. That's fine. That's an important piece of this, that, again, I think a lot of those outside commentators who have clearly never or rarely designed a game don't deal with these things. And that's, if you want to make the argument that civilians belong in a war game, fine. To what purpose? Why am I putting them there? What is it they're expected to accomplish within the context of the game engine and the game design? So tell me why I'm doing this before you tell me that I have to do this. And that's something that doesn't happen in a lot of that criticism. All right. With all of that, I'm kind of wrapped on the commentary here. So questions, comments, obscene remarks, throw them at me. Rob's already thrown up some comments here. If the present civilians make a difference to military outcome, then include them. Otherwise, they are irrelevant and should be excluded as distracting chrome. There's a very solid game design argument right there. Rob, you're right. And it's not a surprise. Rob's one of the game designers out there. So you're right, Rob. That is ultimately probably the guiding, the guiding principle for most game designers. But again, this goes back to, why are they there? What is it that I'm doing with them there? And that's not a question that it seems many of the commentators or critics have addressed or dealt with as a part of that. Most sort of joking here. This actually happened at the first Battle of Bull Run in the Civil War. There were actual civilian observers that thought, "Hey, we'll go have a picnic. We'll watch the Union troops shoot up those poor rebel scum, right? Those poor misguided rebels, and we'll all have a nice afternoon watching the shooting gallery, and then the rebels will surrender, and we'll all go home, and this thing will be over in a week." So yeah, that did actually happen. Didn't really work out that way. Yeah. took a couple of years to finish resolving that one. So while you guys throw in any other questions, comments, thoughts, concerns, I'm going to grab a drink. So, ultimately, like I said, and Rob has reiterated this, it ultimately comes back to what's the purpose those things exist for in the game. What are they doing? Are they just an annoyance? Are they just there to be an operational annoyance to add some variability in the gameplay? Okay. Like that's to certain critics of war games for whom no answer will ever be enough. That's going to seem incredibly trite and lowbrow and unnecessary. The reality is that might be what ends up happening. That might be as far as you get on these things. It might not. There's going to be times where there's going to be times where civilians played a much greater role in the context of the game. There's going to be times where civilians are the entire point of the game. One would argue that any sort of war game that addresses the Warsaw Ghetto uprising in World War II that's military versus civilians. That's exactly what it is. Rob, you probably took this a step farther than a lot of other people looking at the international statutes on war crimes. Again, if somebody wants to incorporate the presence or absence of civilian suffer, or the presence and mitigation of civilian suffering in a war game, that's fine. But understand that the underlying implication is I need a mechanic to increase civilian suffering, which is targeting of civilians. I mean, that's intentional targeting of civilians. Is that really the game we want to design? I'm not sure I want to do that. Rex tends to inspire a lot of people. So I totally get that, Rob. It's a very Canadian thing of you to say. So that's kind of where we are there. We're technically, I got about 8 minutes left in the time that we had set aside for this. That said, we are going to have to cut this a minute or two short because I've got to get some announcements out on the ACDC Discord with some schedule changes. One of our presenters is still without power, and so we're having to shift his sessions around. But if anybody's got a last thought or comment, please throw it in the chat quickly. Otherwise, we're gonna call an index on this, and we're gonna move on to other bigger and better and cooler events with the ACDC here. Mo commentating again there. So, in a way, we've seen the impact of civilians war game directly when there's overall war game made on Vietnam. Yeah, political will is absolutely an issue there, and becomes something that definitely needs to be managed. That's hardly the only game in which that is the case. There are definitely others where the political will of the people is a valid and necessary thing to be built into the war game. One could argue like the entire Twilight Struggle game is about all of that. So, Mike, I'm disappointed that there are no obscene remarks. So, but yeah, human shields are a real thing used by all kinds of military forces. Again, this goes back to how do you build the game mechanic in for that? And so if I'm not going to be shooting certain places because there are human shields in place, then I now have the game mechanic like that. That becomes sort of your civilian armor in the game. Okay, fine. Or do I have the option to shoot through the human shields anyway? In which case now I've built in a mechanic that explicitly allows me to shoot human shields. Right? I want to see that game designer have to go on CNN and say, "Hey, look, I built this into the game for this purpose." He's not going to make a lot of friends or influence a lot of people. So yeah, World War I games do include that at the strategic level. And again, at that level, it's pretty abstract. It's just sort of a very generic sort of political will / suffering mechanic without really thinking too in detail what that means, in terms of like bombing civilians in World War II and bombing the civilians in either England or on the continent. when you had bomber raids, yeah, you were sort of targeting the factories themselves. Those are civilians working the war material factories. So, yeah, Mo, you've got a point there. So, all right, with that said, I think we're gonna go ahead and wrap today's conversation. Those of you that are watching this after the fact, feel free to throw some comments in the comments below here within the YouTube video. That's great. Appreciate you throwing some comments in there. We'll reply to them as we can as life moves on from there. Those of you that joined us live at the ACDC, appreciate you doing that. Those of you that wished you could have joined us live at the ACDC, it's your own fault. You could have joined us for the ACDC, you chose not to, so you're stuck with having to talk to us after the fact instead of interacting live during the presentation. And that is your cue to maybe pay more attention and register for the next one. And so I thank you all for that. And Mo, I hate you for this. You've got your own show. Address it yourself, so I don't have to. It's great. Anyway, everybody, hey, thank you very much for being a part of the ACDC. We thank everybody for being here and joining us this weekend for the virtual game convention, and we look forward to seeing you with the Dragoons down the line another time. Thanks, everybody, and catch you later.